So, me caveman, let's go. Number 8. The Hittite Plague. Picture a king kneeling alone in a stone temple, begging gods who will not answer. Around him, his empire is dying. This is Hattusa, capital of the Hittites, one of the great powers of the Bronze Age, a rival to Egypt and Babylon. And around the year 1322 before the Common Era, a sickness fell on the land and refused to leave. It stayed for roughly 20 years. We know about it because of one of the oldest medical documents on Earth, the Plague Prayers of Mursili II. Mursili was not supposed to be king. The plague killed his father, Suppiluliuma I, and then killed his elder brother, Arnuwanda II. A younger son was left holding a throne and a catastrophe. In his prayers, Mursili does something remarkable. He tries to diagnose the disaster. He decides the gods are punishing his family for his father's sins, a broken oath with Egypt, and the killing of a rightful heir. Think about what that means. There was no germ theory, no understanding of contagion. To a Bronze Age king, a plague was a legal dispute with heaven. So Mursili confesses. He offers restitution. He bargains for relief, the way you might settle a debt. The likely truth is grimmer and more human. Suppiluliuma had campaigned in Syria and dragged home Egyptian prisoners of war, and those prisoners may have carried the disease into the heart of the empire. What was it? In 2007, the researcher Ciro Trevisanato proposed that it was tularemia, a bacterial infection sometimes called rabbit fever. He went further, arguing the Hittites later drove infected animals into enemy Arzawa territory, which would make it the first recorded act of biological warfare. A study in 2023 even found tularemia antibodies in modern people living in that same region. But here's the honest caveat. The prayers describe no symptoms at all, and no ancient DNA has ever confirmed a pathogen. So the mainstream view is simply this: a real, devastating epidemic of an unknown agent. The tularemia idea is a fascinating possibility, not a settled fact. And the fringe reading that this was the same plague Homer describes at the opening of the Iliad, one pandemic crossing the whole eastern Mediterranean, is a step most historians will not take. The clay tablets that preserve these prayers survived in the ruins of Hattusa and sit today in museums in Istanbul, Ankara, and Berlin. They are among the most emotionally raw texts to reach us from the entire Bronze Age, a rare first-person royal voice confronting mass death. And the 20-year timing mattered. The plague gutted Hittite manpower during a period of confrontation with Egypt that would build toward the Great Battle of Kadesh under Mursili's own son. A weakened empire is a vulnerable one. The empire survived. But something else was born here, humanity's first written record of a plague. And if the earliest civilizations were this helpless, what happened when the same helplessness struck a far larger empire? Number 7. The Antonine Plague. The Roman Empire was at its absolute peak, and it brought its own destruction home on the shoulders of victorious soldiers. In the year 165, legions returning from the Parthian War in the Near East carried a sickness back across the empire. It is named the Plague of Galen, after the physician who watched it unfold and wrote it down. Galen was one of the finest medical minds of the ancient world, and his notes are our best evidence. He recorded high fever, diarrhea, an inflamed throat, and a rash that erupted around the 9th day of illness, sometimes dry, sometimes filled with pus, scarring those who lived. To most modern scholars, that description points to smallpox, making this one of the earliest smallpox pandemics in history. The scale was staggering for the ancient world. Roman sources describe up to 2,000 deaths a day in the city of Rome at the worst moments. Across an empire of perhaps 60 to 70 million people, the plague may have killed 5 to 10 million, roughly 1 in 10, with far higher rates in crowded cities and army camps. The co-emperor Lucius Verus died in 169, and many link his death to the disease. Some believe Marcus Aurelius himself died during a later wave in the year 180 on the Danube frontier. The damage went deeper than the death toll. The legions were so thinned that Rome recruited gladiators, slaves, and Germanic auxiliaries to fill the ranks, all while fighting the Marcomannic Wars. The historian Kyle Harper has argued that this plague cracked the confidence and resilience of the Roman world, ending the long prosperity of the Pax Romana. Others, more cautious, note that literary sources exaggerate and that no ancient DNA has yet confirmed smallpox for this outbreak. The overreach to avoid is the idea that this single plague caused the fall of Rome, because Rome endured for 3 more centuries. Galen's own movements tell the story. He fled Rome in 166 as the disease took hold, then was summoned back by the emperors in 168, and stood among the dying troops at Aquileia that winter. The economic historian R.P. Duncan Jones has argued that the plague marked a genuine turning point, disrupting tax revenue, farming, and the flow of coinage across the empire. Still, imagine a modern nation losing 1 in 10 of its people over 15 years, its army hollowed out, its economy shrinking. That is what Rome absorbed, and the next Roman disease would not need Galen's guesswork. This time, scientists would name the killer exactly, and it would be far deadlier. Number 6. The Plague of Justinian. This is the first true bubonic plague pandemic in recorded history, and unlike the Hittite mystery, we know its name with certainty. It is Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, and it struck the Eastern Roman Empire under the Emperor Justinian I. It began in the year 541 at Pelusium, in the Nile Delta of Egypt, and reached the capital Constantinople in 542. The historian Procopius was there. He described the buboes, the grotesque swellings in the groin, the armpit and the neck, and the delirium that took hold of the dying. He claimed 10,000 people died each day in Constantinople at the peak. That number is almost certainly exaggerated, but the horror behind it was real. For centuries, this was just a story in an old text. Then, in 2014, a team led by David Wagner and Michaela Harbeck extracted ancient DNA from 2 skeletons in a cemetery at Aschheim in Bavaria and confirmed it. Yersinia pestis. The debate was over. A 2019 study went further, recovering plague genomes from across Western Europe, from Britain to Spain, and showing that this strain spread and diversified widely before going extinct. The Justinianic plague sits on a branch of the family tree that no longer exists. The timing could not have been worse for Justinian. He was in the middle of an enormous project, reconquering the lost Western Roman Empire, retaking Italy, North Africa, and part of Spain, with his generals Belisarius and Narses. The plague drained the manpower and the money that Dream required. It struck alongside a brutal cold snap, the late antique Little Ice Age, triggered by a volcanic dust veil in the year 536. Some scholars argue this weakened both the Byzantine and Persian worlds so badly that it helped clear the way for the rise of Islam a century later. Now, not everyone agrees on the scale. A revisionist camp, led by researchers like Lee Mordecai, argues that the maximalist figures of 25 to 50 million dead are overstated, that pollen and archaeology do not show total collapse everywhere. What no one disputes is that the disease was real, confirmed, and recurring, returning every generation for 200 years. It was carried by black rats and their fleas along the grain ships of the Mediterranean. Justinian himself is said to have caught the plague in 542 and survived it, ruling on over a hollowed-out empire. The Aschheim discovery did more than confirm one outbreak. It built the genetic bridge between the ancient plague strains and the medieval one to come. and this same pathogen would return 8 centuries later, worse than anyone imagined. Number 5. The English sweating sickness. Not every civilization-shaking disease topples an empire. Some just terrify a nation, kill without warning, and then vanish forever. That is the story of the English sweating sickness, or Sudor Anglicus. It appeared in 5 sudden outbreaks, in 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and 1551. And then it was gone. The first outbreak arrived with eerie timing in 1485, right as Henry Tudor marched into London after his victory at Bosworth, at the very birth of the Tudor dynasty. The physician John Caius left the best account. It began with cold shivers, then headache, aching limbs, and then a drenching, soaking sweat, fever, and terrible breathlessness. What made it a nightmare was the speed. A person could go from perfectly healthy to dead in as little as 3 to 18 hours. If you survived a full day, you usually lived, and it broke every rule people thought they understood about disease. It produced almost no skin lesions, unlike plague. It preferred the rich and the robust, striking down strong men between 15 and 45. In 1485, it killed 2 Lord Mayors of London and several aldermen in a single week. The outbreak of 1528 so frightened Henry VIII that he broke up his court and fled from house to house. Anne Boleyn caught the sweat and survived. Thomas Cromwell's wife and daughters are said to have died of it. So what was it? In 1997, a team led by Guy Thwaites proposed in the New England Journal of Medicine that it was a viral disease of the lungs. The leading suspect is a hantavirus, a rodent-borne virus that causes a rapid, deadly respiratory illness today. A related disease in France, the Picardy sweat, strengthens that link. Others have suggested relapsing fever, influenza, even anthrax. The truth is, we do not know. No skeleton has ever been securely tied to a sweating sickness death, so there is no ancient DNA to test. This is the mystery entry on our list, the disease that shaped Tudor politics, emptied a royal court, and then disappeared without leaving a single confirmable trace. It is proof that a pathogen can arrive, kill, and burn out completely. And while England sweated, an ocean away, disease was doing something far larger. It was erasing whole civilizations. Number 4. The Cocoliztli Epidemic. The word Cocoliztli comes from Nahuatl, and it simply means pestilence. It names one of the deadliest epidemics in all of human history, measured by the share of a population it destroyed. The worst wave came in 1545, with another devastating return in 1576. The symptoms were horrifying. High fever, splitting headache, vertigo, a black tongue, dark urine, dysentery, jaundice, and bleeding from the nose, the eyes, and the mouth. Francisco Hernández de Toledo, the personal physician to King Philip II of Spain, watched the 1576 outbreak with his own eyes and said plainly that it matched no European disease he knew. The 1545 wave alone may have killed 5 to 15 million people, up to 80% of the native population of central Mexico. The later wave killed millions more. For centuries, the cause was a total mystery. Then, molecular archaeology cracked it open. In 2018, a team led by Oshild Vogene, Johannes Krause, and Kirsten Boss studied the only known Cocoliztli cemetery at Tepozcalula Yucunda in the highlands of Oaxaca. Using a new tool called MALT, which searches for ancient pathogen DNA, without guessing in advance, they found the same bacterium in 10 different victims. It was Salmonella enterica, the Paratyphi C strain, which causes an enteric fever nearly identical to typhoid, spreading through contaminated food and water. A similar strain has turned up in a Norwegian skeleton from around the year 1200, hinting that Europeans introduced it. But there is a serious rival theory. The Mexican researcher Rodolfo Acuña Soto argues that Cocoliztli was actually an indigenous viral hemorrhagic fever, driven by climate. His tree ring studies show that both great epidemics followed severe droughts that then broke into wet years, exactly the conditions that cause rodent populations to explode. And those bleeding, hemorrhagic symptoms, he points out, fit a virus far better than they fit Salmonella. The debate is not settled. It is entirely possible that several diseases struck at once. Smallpox and measles and enteric fever together, in overlapping waves against a people with no immunity, and a society shattered by conquest. The demographic collapse did not just kill people. It gutted the labor force so completely that it helped drive the Atlantic slave trade, as colonizers looked to replace the workers they had lost. And the cemetery at Tepescalula was itself a landmark, a rare sealed mass grave from the exact moment of contact, which is why the ancient DNA there could speak so clearly. However it happened, the result was one of the greatest demographic collapses ever recorded. And it was only one piece of something continental in scale. The same dying had an old world twin. A plague that once cut Europe in half. Number 3. The Black Death. This is the benchmark, the pandemic against which all others are measured. Between 1347 and 1351, the second great pandemic of Yersinia pestis killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people, and wiped out an estimated 30 to 60% of everyone in Europe. It reached Europe in 1347 when Genoese trading ships arrived at Messina in Sicily from the Black Sea. And the origin story is one of the darkest in history. In 1346, the Mongol army of the Golden Horde was besieging the city of Kaffa in Crimea. According to the notary Gabriele de Musi, the Mongols catapulted their own plague dead over the city walls, an early act of biological warfare. Modern genetics traces the ultimate source further back and further east, to Central Asia. A 2022 study identified plague victims from the years 1338 and 1339 near Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan, close to where the strain first emerged. We know exactly what killed them because of the bones of London. In 2011, a team led by Kirsten Boss and Johannes Kraus sequenced a draft genome of the bacterium from 4 individuals in the East Smithfield Cemetery, an emergency burial ground where more than 2,000 plague dead were laid in 1348 and 1349. And here is the unsettling part. The medieval genome barely differed from modern plague, which does not explain why it was so much deadlier. That London strain is the ancestor of most plague lineages alive today, the mother of all plagues. The disease came in 3 forms. Bubonic, with its swollen buboes, killing perhaps half of those infected. Pneumonic, an infection of the lungs, spreading directly from person to person and killing almost everyone. And septicemic, in the bloodstream, killing fast. Giovanni Boccaccio opened his Decameron with the plague in Florence, a city that may have lost more than half its people. The consequences reshaped the world. Labor became scarce, wages rose, serfdom weakened, and in England, the anger fed the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. There were flagellant movements and vicious pogroms against Jewish communities, falsely blamed for the deaths. The plague crept across the land at roughly 1 to 2 kilometers a day on foot, and raced far faster along the shipping lanes. Europe's population would not recover for 2 or 3 centuries. And the plague was not finished. It returned in wave after wave, all the way to the Great Plague of London in 1665. And the next case shows a pathogen doing to a single empire what no invading army ever could. Number 2. Smallpox and the fall of the Inca. The Inca Empire, known to its people as Tawantinsuyu, was the largest state in the history of the Americas, stretching down the spine of the Andes from Colombia to Chile, ruled from the great city of Cusco. And it was brought to its knees by a disease that arrived before the conquerors did. This is the terrifying pattern of the age. Smallpox reached the Inca overland, moving from Spanish contact zones far to the north, years before Francisco Pizarro and his men set foot in the empire. Around the years 1524 to 1527, the Emperor Huayna Capac fell ill and died, most likely of smallpox, while campaigning near Quito. And the disease did not stop there. It killed his named heir, Ninan Cuyochi, almost at the same moment. Think about what that did. In the space of a season, a pathogen decapitated an empire. With the emperor and his chosen successor both dead, two other sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, went to war for the throne. That civil war tore Tawantinsuyu apart between roughly 1529 and 1532. Atahualpa had just defeated and captured his brother when Pizarro arrived with fewer than 200 Spaniards. He walked into an empire that had already been gutted from within, exhausted, and divided at the worst possible moment. The disease spread with cruel efficiency along the Incas' own greatest achievement, their road network, the Capac Ñan, some 40,000 kilometers of highway binding a dense and connected population. The very infrastructure that built the empire carried its killer. Smallpox may have taken 200,000 lives or more in that first wave alone. And because the Sapa Inca was considered a living son of the sun, a divine ruler, his sudden death shattered not just the government, but the entire spiritual order. We should be careful here. The historian Robert McCaw has cautioned that we cannot prove the exact disease, that the figures are estimates, and that smallpox is our best inference rather than a certainty. No ancient DNA has confirmed it. But the shape of the story is clear. Disease acted as an advance guard, an unwitting weapon of conquest, arriving first and breaking an empire before a single major battle with the Spanish. Atahualpa himself was captured by Pizarro at Cajamarca in November of 1532 and executed the following year. And smallpox was only the beginning. Waves of measles, typhus, and influenza followed, until the population of the Andes had fallen by well over half within a few decades. Now, take everything that happened to this one empire and multiply it across two entire continents. Number 1, the Great Dying of the Americas. This is the largest demographic catastrophe in all of recorded human history, and it may have left a fingerprint on the climate of the entire planet. Historians call it the Great Dying, the collapse of the indigenous population of the Americas after 1492, driven above all by imported disease. In 2019, 4 geographers at University College London, Alexander Koch, Chris Brierley, Mark Maslin, and Simon Lewis, published a careful study of the numbers. They estimated the population of the Americas before contact at around 60 million people. And they estimated that by the year 1600, roughly 56 million of them were dead. That is about 90% of an entire hemisphere. The killers came in wave after overlapping wave. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, plague, mumps, and later yellow fever and malaria. The reason they were so lethal comes down to one word: isolation. The peoples of the Americas had been separated from the diseases of Europe, Asia, and Africa for more than 15,000 years. They had few domesticated herd animals to breed such diseases, and almost no acquired immunity to fight them. To these crowd diseases, 2 whole continents were virgin soil. And here's where the story becomes almost unbelievable. When so many people died, an estimated 55 million hectares of farmland and managed forest were simply abandoned. Nature took it back. Trees grew over the empty fields, and all that new growth pulled carbon dioxide out of the sky. The Koch team estimated a measurable drop in atmospheric carbon dioxide around the year 1610, a dip you can actually read in Antarctic ice cores. The scientists Maslin and Lewis named it the Orbis Spike, from the Latin word for world, and proposed it as a start date for the Anthropocene. That cooling deepened the coldest stretch of the Little Ice Age. In other words, the death of 90% of a hemisphere may have helped chill the whole planet. Inside this catastrophe sit the specific horrors. The smallpox that broke the defenders of Tenochtitlan in 1520 and helped Cortés take the Aztec capital, killing the Emperor Cuitlahuac. The Cocoliztli epidemics. The smallpox that felled the Inca. The historian Alfred Crosby gave us the framework to understand it all in 1972, the Columbian Exchange, and the idea of virgin soil epidemics. Whole cultures and languages vanished before any European ever wrote them down. In some regions, local mortality reached 90 or 95% within a single century. The exact number of people alive before contact is still argued over, with older estimates ranging from a few million to more than 100 million, and the 60 million figure is a careful modern synthesis. The effects rippled through nature, too. As human management of the land collapsed, the bison herds of the Great Plains and the vast flocks of passenger pigeons may have surged into the space the dead left behind. The labor vacuum drove the transatlantic slave trade, and the deepest lesson of this entire countdown lands right here. Across all of human history, it was not always the armies that decided the fate of civilizations. Sometimes it was the smallest living things on Earth. Step back from the 8, and a single machine of collapse comes into focus. In almost every case, the pattern is the same. A new pathogen meets a population with no defense against it, and then something amplifies the disaster, trade, war, or drought. The infrastructure of contagion was always the pride of each civilization. The Roman roads, the Mediterranean grain ships, the Inca highways, the Silk Road caravans. The very connections that made these societies great became the veins through which death traveled. Look at how often the disease struck at the top. Suppiluliuma of the Hittites, Lucius Verus of Rome, Huayna Capac of the Inca. A pathogen does not respect a crown, and killing a ruler could unleash a succession war deadlier than the disease itself. Look at the problem of recurrence, how the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death both came back for generations, denying their victims any chance to recover. And look at climate as the silent partner, the volcanic winter of 536, the mega drought behind Cocoliztli, the Little Ice Age. The clearest divide of all is this. Some civilizations, like Rome and the Hittites, absorbed the shock and endured. Others, isolated and immunologically naive, did not. What let us finally see this machinery was not an old chronicle. It was ancient DNA, turning legend into evidence. There is a bitter irony at the center of this story. The diseases that destroyed civilizations were, in a sense, created by civilization itself. Crowd diseases like smallpox, measles, and plague need dense settled populations to spread and survive. A scattered band of hunter-gatherers cannot sustain them. Cities can. Almost all of these killers began as zoonotic diseases, crossing over from animals, smallpox and measles from herd animals, plague from rodents, salmonella from the food supply. This explains the great asymmetry of the age. The Old World, with its many domesticated herd animals, its dense cities, and its long trade webs, bred a terrifying arsenal of pathogens. When those diseases reached the Americas, they hit populations that had never encountered them, with no herd immunity and little genetic resistance. That is why disease flowed overwhelmingly from Europe to the Americas and almost never the other way. Isolated populations faced an added danger. Long separation could narrow a people's genetic diversity, including the very immune genes that help fight new infections, leaving them even more exposed when a novel disease finally arrived. And behind all of it lay a single blind spot. Not one of these societies knew what was actually killing them. They tried prayer, they tried flight, they tried quarantine by instinct. Sometimes those instincts worked. Far more often, against an enemy they could not see, they did not. For all our science, the gaps are enormous. The Hittite Plague, after more than 3,000 years, still has no confirmed pathogen and no ancient DNA. the sweating sickness remains genuinely undiagnosed, a disease that may simply be extinct. Even Cocoliztli, where researchers found salmonella, is not fully solved because those hemorrhagic, bleeding symptoms keep the rival viral theory alive. The Inca smallpox is inferred entirely from Spanish chronicles, never confirmed in a single genome. Scholars still fight over the true death toll of the Plague of Justinian, maximalists against revisionists. We do not even have a firm figure for how many people lived in the Americas before contact, with estimates ranging from a handful of millions to over 100 million. And in every case, one question refuses to close. How much of each collapse was truly the disease? And how much was the war, the famine, and the social breakdown that came with it? Perhaps the strangest puzzle of all is why some ancient strains, like the medieval plague, were so much more lethal than their nearly identical descendants alive today. None of this is safely locked in the past. Yersinia pestis, the agent of both the Justinianic Plague and the Black Death, still exists and still infects people every year. Tularemia, the Hittite suspect, is watched today as a potential agent of bioterrorism. Hantaviruses, the leading suspect behind the sweating sickness, cause deadly outbreaks in the present. The killers on this list did not go extinct. Most of them are still here. What has changed is that we can finally read them. Ancient DNA now works almost like an early warning system, letting scientists reconstruct how pathogens evolve, how they jump from animals to humans, and how they turn lethal. The link between megadrought and epidemic that Acuña Soto found in the tree rings of Mexico is a warning for a warming world where shifting climate can push diseases into new places. Global trade is simply the modern version of those old plague routes, faster and wider than any Roman ship. A pathogen that once needed months to cross a sea can now cross the world in a single day. The virgin soil lesson still matters too, for isolated communities and for immune systems that have never met a given disease. And the Orbis spike leaves us with a haunting thought. Human catastrophe on a large enough scale does not just change history. It can leave a mark on the planet itself, written into the air and the ice for anyone in the future to read. So here is the thread that ties all 8 together. The mightiest civilizations the world had ever seen, the Hittites, Rome, Byzantium, the Aztecs, the Inca, were undone again and again, not by their rivals, but by the invisible. From a Bronze Age king writing desperate prayers to gods who would not listen, to 56 million dead across 2 American continents, the scale is almost impossible to hold in the mind. The lesson repeats in every chapter. Complexity and connection are also vulnerability. Roads, cities, trade, and empire, the greatest strengths these societies possessed, were the very things that carried their ruin from door to door. And there is a quiet horror in realizing that the destroyers were so often ordinary. Not monsters, but microbes. A bacterium in the water. A virus on the breath. For most of human history, our ancestors could not name these enemies, could not see them, and could only bury the dead and pray. We can name them now. We can read them in bones, in clay tablets, and in bubbles of ancient air trapped in polar ice. And when we do, we learn the humbling truth at the heart of this countdown. In the long story of civilization, some of the largest chapters were written by the smallest living things on Earth.